The adrenal glands are located on the kidneys, and because of that, the adrenal glands are also referred to as the suprarenal glands. The adrenal gland is actually two glands in one. The outer portion is the adrenal cortex, which synthesizes many different hormones, which we're going to go over. And the interior is the adrenal medulla, which is actually part of the sympathetic nervous system that we covered in part 1. The adrenal cortex produces corticosteroids, cortical for the cortex, steroids for the class of hormones that it secretes. 24 different types, but we'll be looking at different groups of corticosteroids. These hormones are not stored in the cells. They get released as they are produced. And the adrenal cortex is made up of these 3 layers or zones, which are called zona glomerulosa, fasciculata, and reticularis, which make their own classes of hormones: mineralocorticoids, glucocorticoids, and gonadocorticoids, which we'll be going over. Here we can see a microscope image, which will be important for lab, of the different zones or regions of the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla, which is deeper. When we go deep to this fatty capsule, we get into this zona glomerulosa, where aldosterone is produced. We'll be going over this hormone in a little bit. Deeper in the adrenal cortex, we get the zona fasciculata, where our cortisol and androgens are produced, as well as in the zona reticularis, which is the deepest area of the adrenal cortex. In the adrenal medulla, we have epinephrine and norepinephrine being produced and released. The zona glomerulosa of the adrenal cortex produces this first type of hormone called mineralocorticoids. They regulate electrolyte concentrations, mainly our sodium ions and our potassium ions in our extracellular fluid. Now, sodium ions are very important for your blood volume because as sodium enters fluid, water follows it. So just think of it, sodium ions, as being a magnet for fluid, which will increase blood pressure as fluid travels towards that, the sodium ions, if we're talking about the blood. Of all the mineralocorticoids, aldosterone is the most potent of the group. What aldosterone does as a hormone, it causes our kidneys to reabsorb sodium ions. These sodium ions that were to be part of the urine gets put back into the blood where it came from. That's called reabsorption. When sodium enters the blood, fluid follows it into the blood. That results in increased blood volume, and if more fluid is entering the blood, that blood pressure increases. At the same time, potassium is eliminated by the kidneys. Here's a mechanism causing aldosterone to be released by the adrenal cortex. So when blood volume drops, the kidneys release renin. Renin will go through a number of reactions, but the final product is angiotensin II in the blood. That causes the adrenal cortex to release aldosterone. And we know what aldosterone does now. It causes the kidneys to reabsorb sodium, increasing blood volume and blood pressure. Therefore, increasing the blood volume and blood pressure that was low to begin with in this pathway. Increased potassium in the blood could actually do the same thing. If there's stress on the body, emotional stress, physical stress, well, the hypothalamus will release its releasing hormone to the anterior pituitary. We learned that the anterior pituitary can release this one hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, which will stimulate the adrenal cortex to release aldosterone, which will the end result of it will increase the blood pressure. If blood pressure is high, well, that will inhibit aldosterone release. So we can see the main effect on aldosterone is increasing blood volume and blood pressure by these three different pathways. And then we have this one pathway that will inhibit it. Aldosteronism is hypersecretion of aldosterone. And if we know what aldosterone does, you can predict what will happen if there's too much of it. Hypertension, because of excessive sodium in the blood, would be a major problem. And then too much excretion of potassium ions, and which is important for your nervous system and muscular system, which will result in these symptoms here. The adrenal cortex also produces and releases a second category of hormones called glucocorticoids. The main one we're going to be concerned with is cortisol. Cortisol will help the body respond to stress. Keeps blood glucose levels relatively constant, makes glucose available to the body in stressful times or stressful environments, and maintains our blood pressure by increasing the action of our vasoconstrictors. Vasoconstrictor means constricting blood vessels. Vaso has to do with blood vessels. Excessive secretion of cortisol could result in Cushing's syndrome or Cushing's disease. Usually it's a tumor on the pituitary and other areas in the body. It will depress the immune system. It will inhibit inflammation. There will be dramatic loss of muscle and bone proteins. And these are classic signs of Cushing syndrome: moon face, buffalo hump, which I'll go to the next slide. There's that fatty pad that develops in the kind of the base of the neck in Cushing syndrome. A hyposecretion of cortisol, and even of aldosterone as well, which is a mineralocorticoid, is Addison's disease. Now we see a decrease in plasma glucose, a decrease in sodium levels, which you can predict because of the hyposecretion of the hormones in question here. You can see the symptoms: weight loss, dehydration, hypotension, which is low blood pressure. That's common. A bronzing of the skin is a classic sign of Addison's disease, and hormone replacement therapy is typically the treatment. So here's a good summary of these adrenal cortex hormones. When there's stress on the body, these hormones will help us deal with this stress. And here's how it works. Well, the hypothalamus will release corticotropin-releasing hormone. There it is, in this portal system, right to the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary cells will release adrenal corticotropic hormone, which travels in the bloodstream. When it gets to the adrenal cortex, it will cause the release of glucocorticoids like cortisol, and mineralocorticoids like aldosterone, where aldosterone will act on the kidneys to reabsorb sodium into the blood to increase the blood volume and increase blood pressure, while the cortisol will have metabolic effects on the body, like increasing blood amino acids from protein breakdown, increasing blood glucose by breaking down glycogen from the liver and putting it into the blood, fat breakdown, so increasing fatty acids, fuel for muscles. This suppresses the immune system, but it maintains blood pressure. So all of this is happening to help us deal and act on these stressors that were placed on the body.